So, reset. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this article that about 18 colleagues wrote together in Nature. It appeared only about 3 weeks ago, and it was on the question of germline editing. So I want to provide a little bit of the context for this article. It was joined by a bunch of interesting people, including Françoise Baylis, Feng Zhang and Emmanuel Charpentier, some of the important scientists who developed CRISPR genome editing, Paul Berg, who was a co-author of the 1975 call for a moratorium on recombinant DNA. So it was an interesting group. I'm going to talk about that, and hopefully we'll even get to the end about a broader question of failures of imagination. But I want to come to that a bit later. So number one, I'm going to assume that everybody must have heard of genome editing by now. CRISPR is known to the taxi drivers, so I'm not going to go into any details and I'm not going to show any pictures. But I am going to distinguish, just to remind you, the difference between somatic gene editing and somatic non-reproductive tissue that you might use to edit genes that cause dominant retinitis pigmentosum, a blindness, or Duchenne muscular dystrophy, or an LDL receptor mutation in the liver that causes familial hypercholesterolemia. All of these somatic editing examples are ones where there is an existing patient who has a disease and can consent. And the effects are limited to that patient. They're not transmitted to the next generation. And I distinguish that from germline editing, which is making genetically modified babies, just to be blunt in the language. And so making genetically modified babies is a different question. There is not a patient there that can consent. Whatever happens is passed on to future generations and can only be removed from the human population if the individual who carries it agrees to that. There's no way to take it back out. There's no way to issue a product recall notice on that. So that these remain permanent changes unless actively removed with permission. And in many cases, there isn't an existing disease that you're treating. The range of possibilities is broad. That ranges all the way to potential improvements, things that you think would make a better human than 3 billion years of evolution has produced. So there are different things. In 2015, the National Academy of Sciences, together with the Royal Society, the US National Academy, and the Royal Society and the Chinese Academy, organized a meeting in Washington, the first summit on human gene editing. I was part of the organizing committee of this meeting, and mimicking the spirit of a Silmar, the organizers issued a statement at the end of the meeting. We met the night before and debated at great length, and our statement included various things, but with regard to germline editing, it said specifically, it would be irresponsible to do this unless and until two things had happened. Number one, the technical safety issues had been resolved. Off-target editing, efficacy, these simple issues, they're just technical. And number two, unless and until there was broad societal consent about the appropriateness of each application. This was not that difficult. There was debate about what did broad societal consent mean, but everyone understood that things like genetically modified foods had gone out from Monsanto without anything resembling societal consent, and that had backfired rather badly, probably to the detriment of society, and it was not enough to merely have technical considerations of accuracy of the editing. We had to think about the broader implications societally. There was some debate that evening about whether to use the M word, moratorium. For various reasons, we decided not to use the M word because we figured it was pretty obvious we meant you weren't supposed to do this for a while. That's what a moratorium is a temporary prohibition. But some folks felt that the M word could get confused with a permanent ban in the newspapers, and so we figured we would say what we meant. You shouldn't do this for now, rather than rely on the fact that people could look up moratorium in the dictionary. So anyway, 3 years later, Hong Kong, the second International Gene Editing Summit takes place, and the big event was the announcement by He Jiankui that he had performed exactly what we said would be irresponsible to do at this time, namely producing genetically modified babies. Not only that, it was an ethical train wreck. Everything that could go wrong went wrong. He did it in secret. He had no ethical permissions. He performed the consent on the patients themselves. Investigators can't do that. He produced the wrong edits in the genome and decided to proceed. Why? Because he asked the parents who knew nothing about science, should I proceed? And they said, sure. And so he proceeded. And the entire premise of the experiment was kind of crazy because it wasn't about preventing any disease. This wasn't going to prevent these kids from getting HIV from their HIV-infected father. It was only going to potentially protect them when they were adults and might contract HIV from sexual contact. So it was a poorly justified, everything that could go wrong went wrong. But frankly, that wasn't what bothered many of us. The fact that there are rogue actors who do immoral things is a commonplace. We know that happens, that's why we have laws, that's why we punish people. We're much more worried about the fact that many US, UK, and Chinese scientists knew about this and said nothing. That was really worrying. We were bothered by the fact that many of the scientists who wanted to perform germline editing for much better purposes reacted to this experiment by saying, we can't let this get in the way of our experiments. We must make sure that there is a clinical path forward. Rather than taking even a moment to stop and say, should we reflect on what happened, it was circling the wagons, as we might say in American English, to defend the need to go forward. No longer was even the question whether we should do this on the table, it was how should we do it? What was the regulatory pathway? And there were famously some slides put up by excellent scientists who said, you know, things like HIV prevention, that's perfectly reasonable to consider for germline editing. I'll return to that point. And then on top of it, there had been in the previous 3 years a growing number of proposals to do pretty adventurous enhancement. My colleague at Harvard, George Church, proposed creating genetically modified humans who were radiation resistant to be able to travel in outer space, or looking at polygenic risk scores or polygenic scores for intelligence to make 1,000 edits across the genome to make smarter people. This too gave us some pause and said, maybe we should actually stop and have a conversation about some of this. So we wrote an article. The article largely focused on what were the issues. We said these were complicated issues. And these complicated issues had important societal consequences. And we ought to think about what were governance frameworks, an international governance framework for how nations should make these decisions. Nations should make these decisions. So the article we wrote, which I think you've all seen, and so I won't go into full detail, looked at the technical issues. We devoted about a paragraph to the technical issues because they're straightforward. It should be accurate. You shouldn't make off-target edits. Straightforward. More complicated, though, were the medical and scientific issues. Medically, it is said the reason for doing germline editing is to prevent kids being born with serious genetic diseases. This is a red herring. If a couple knows that they are at risk of having a kid with a serious genetic disease, they can use pre-implantation genetic diagnostics with in vitro fertilization and be sure that they do not implant an embryo that passes on the genetic disease. There is essentially zero risk of having a kid with a genetic disease. What's the issue? The issue is that IVF with PGD isn't perfect. And so sometimes when you filter out the embryos, you don't get any that are unaffected. So it's not about the risk of having a kid, it's the risk that you might not get an embryo you can implant. It's about assisted reproduction. And so out of a sense that everyone had the need, or had a right to have the genetically related child, came the notion that it would be important to provide germline editing. But we should be clear, it is not to prevent cases of genetic disease. You could prevent it today if you had done genetic testing in the first place, and almost everybody who has a kid with a serious genetic disease is in a family that didn't have genetic testing. So if you really wanted to prevent genetic disease, you would do a lot more genetic testing, or at least offer that opportunity. So there's the extreme case of a father who's homozygous for Huntington's. All of his kids will be affected. In that case, he can't have an unaffected child, and germline editing might let him have a genetically related child, but they're perfectly well aware that that is the situation today. They can't have one. More exciting are the genetic enhancements. Again, my friend George Church in 2015 was chatting with me, and he said, FUT2. There's a normal variation in the FUT2 gene, which inactivates the gene, and if you have that inactivation and you're homozygous for that inactivation, you are protected from noroviruses. You know, the cruise ship viruses where you throw up and you have diarrhea for 2 days. It's terrible. I got a norovirus once in Southeast Asia. It's terrible. And George said, if you don't have that gene, you don't get a norovirus. So we should delete that gene from the human population. So I went back to the Broad and just looked up in our genetic databases and found that, yeah, that's true. Oh, but by the way, also it increases your risk of Crohn's disease and will lead to 250,000 more cases of Crohn's disease with a 10-fold increase in colon cancer. So I said to George, George, that will be a consequence of this. And George said, well, I didn't know that, which is the point. There's a lot we don't know. We may have had this earth-shaking reading the human genome, but we don't know how to interpret all of it. And the fact that George didn't know it and I knew it was an accident. But we have genes like SLC39A8, where there's a common genetic variant. It decreases your risk of Parkinson's. It decreases your risk of hypertension. But it increases your risk of schizophrenia, Crohn's disease, and obesity. If you knew some but not others, what are you supposed to do? And then CCR5, the gene that was deleted by He Jiankui. He Jiankui's deletion there, if you were homozygous knocked out for that gene, you would indeed have reasonable protection from HIV, but your risk of fatal encephalopathy from West Nile disease would be substantially higher. Same too from flu. Plus the long list of things that we don't know today. So there's a lot to be said. I'm not saying we shouldn't ever do things where we don't know everything, but we're really pretty early in what we're doing here. And then what about circuitry? Suppose it's not just fix this nucleotide to make it, his version of the gene, but I invent a new circuit entirely to let you do something good, maybe cause your cancer cells to commit suicide. Now he invents a new circuit that causes cells to do something else that's also good. Then the children with this and the children with this, meet a couple generations later, they go to the same college. How are we supposed to know how these two new circuits will interact? This offers new opportunities for genetic matchmaking that are extraordinary, saying it's ill-advised for somebody with your circuit and that circuit to get married. So there are a lot of issues around these things. Finally, there's the question of societal pressures. The conversations around the playground a generation or so from now. So, did you get the genetic changes to make your child taller? And the uncomfortable parents saying, well, we didn't really do that, and they're going to feel, awkward with the other people there, and then there's, marketing pressures with all of this. Who knows? It's an interesting world that we may enter into. And I think, without meaning to overstate any of it, we thought it was worth stopping and having the conversation about what kind of world did we want to have? Where did we want to draw lines? One line, never, ever, ever do germline editing for any purpose. I know some people who believe that. Another line, for serious genetic disorders, when they want to have a kid, that's okay, But all this enhancement stuff, not okay. Another line, let the free market reign. IVF clinics can advertise any enhancement they would like to have. There's a whole range of possibilities we might have in this world. We thought it would be good to have a conversation about it. Where would you like to live on this slippery slope? Put your house here, put your house here, put your house here. Do make sure that it's screwed in tight because the slope does slip. So, we proposed two things. We should have a moratorium for a period of about 5 years while we talk about it. It was a fixed period, we suggested 5 years. And then we said, during this period, we should actually put in place an international governance structure to help us think about this. A couple of red herrings emerge in the conversation. We used the word moratorium deliberately to be provocative because we knew it would get people's attention. But folks hate the M word. So there's a lot of fuss over, should we use the moratorium word? Now we have a moratorium. Let's be straightforward. When we say it would be irresponsible to do this at this moment, that is called a moratorium. You shouldn't do it now is the dictionary definition of moratorium. But a number of people, including my very good friend, who is perhaps my most respected person in the world, David Baltimore, said, don't use the moratorium word because people will misunderstand it. We decided at this point we wanted to use that word and force people to understand it, and it was a good thing to do it, but I respect the fact that he said otherwise. My friend George Daly at the Harvard Medical School said it will discourage young people from going into the field. I pointed out to George, it's against the law in the United States. Illegal is actually far more serious than a moratorium, and if young people are going to get discouraged, they should get discouraged by the fact that it's against the law. But anyway, then people ask, would this have prevented He Jiankui? My answer is, who cares? That wasn't what it's for. The goal was to ask what nations should do. Rogue actors are not the question here. The question is grown-up nations. How should grown-up nations approach this? Grown-up nations pass laws. They punish rogue actors. This is China's problem to punish He Jiankui. We have laws against murder. People still murder. We throw them in jail. It's not perfect, but it's not bad. So He Jiankui was not the focus. The focus was, what should nations do? We laid out an extremely simple thing. We said, nations are sovereign. They can do what they want. We can't stop them. But there should be transparency. Before a nation goes and considers a new application, it should say, we're considering a new application, and it should participate in consultation. We suggested 2 years, which didn't seem like a heavy lift. Some consultation. And then the nation was free to go forward, provided it would say that in its own judgment, number one, we've considered it carefully and we think it's appropriate, and number two, we believe we have broad societal consent. It's a pretty easy lift. I was expecting we'd get grief because it was too simple. But in fact, and we did from some people, and from other people we got the lift from, oh my God, if nations had to consult, actually one of my colleagues in the UK said, if the UK had to consult with other nations, we might feel really uncomfortable because other nations might not like that. To which my answer was, that's the point. If you don't feel strongly enough about this to be willing to go forward in the presence of consultation with others who don't agree, you shouldn't be going forward. So this was the rough framework we had, and we said it should be supported by serious science. There should be an intergovernmental panel that provides neutral scientific advice about the state of the art, etc. That was the proposal. I think it was wonderful. We got the National Institutes of Health in the United States endorsed the moratorium, the European Society of Human Genetics endorsed it, the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology endorsed it. Even better, the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine, and the Royal Society endorsed the part that I felt most strongly about, which is they all said, we must achieve broad societal consensus given the global implications of germline editing. That was actually far more significant than the M word or not, was the recognition by the academies that we did need broad societal consensus, so we didn't replicate what Monsanto had done. Finally, I will close by just noting that I don't think this problem stands alone. This decade, we see a number of technological problems that are all of the following form. There's an amazing technological opportunity, like genome editing is. It's fantastic. But there are potential serious downsides. How are we going to govern that? We have the same question with regard to gene drives. How are we going to govern that? Amazing upsides, serious potential downsides. We have the same problem with regard to solar geoengineering, putting up reflecting particles to reflect away the sunlight to try to protect us against climate change. You know, interesting, what could possibly go wrong? Artificial intelligence. How shall we govern lethal autonomous weapons? What about bias in AI? Never before have we seen so many instances of cases where some form of international conversation and governance is going to be needed. Just think back to Facebook. Connect the world, connect everybody in the world. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it turns out some things could go wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. What I am saying is we have an ethical obligation to imagine the future. That does not mean we should never go forward in the face of uncertainty. We must go forward in the face of uncertainty sometimes, but we have an ethical obligation to imagine and think about what steps we may take to prevent the downsides of that future. I think the biggest issue with Facebook was a failure of imagination, even on the part of Mark Zuckerberg. I know Mark. I think he did not intend to have this happen. I think he's bothered by the fact that some of this happened. He made, tens of billions of dollars by the fact this has happened too, which maybe meant that he didn't press himself quite as hard as he might have otherwise. But I think the failure of imagination is a big issue for us. We must navigate between saying we can do nothing because we're paralyzed about the possibility that something could go wrong, and the idea that we say, well, we can't stop technology. No, we can guide technology, and ethical, moral people need to guide technology to make sure we get the benefits we want with as few of the problems as we can possibly get. That's it.